Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this month's Urban Food Policy Forum event and book talk focusing on the book Feeding Each Other, Shaping Change in Food Systems Through Relationship by Nicole Civita and Michelle Auerbach. My name is Dr. Rusica Ilieva, and I'm the Director of Policy at the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute and an Adjunct Assistant Professor at CUNY SPH. And I'm honored to welcome our guest speakers, student panelists, and you all to today's event and conversation. In a world where the community and regional food systems that nourish us are being fundamentally challenged and are challenging us at so many levels, the insights shared in Feeding Each Other offer a valuable perspective on how we can shape positive change within our food systems through a paradigm shift and the fundamental notion of food as a relationship. We have intentionally conceived this event not just as a book talk, but a wider conversation that extends beyond the pages of the book. In the time we have today, we look forward to exploring together with you all the intricate relationships that exist within our food systems and the ways in which we can collectively contribute to their positive evolution and what we can do toward a meaningful and durable transformation right now. Throughout our time today, together with the authors and 4 guest student panelists from CUNY, we'll delve into key themes, examine challenges, and seek inspiration from case studies and examples of everyday practices for shaping a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient food future. We'll start with a short presentation of the book by the authors, which will be followed by our panel discussion, and then we'll open the floor for questions from you all in the audience. You'll be able to submit your questions via the chat function to the Zoom host and co-host, Katie Tomaino-Fraser. So without further ado, please join me in a warm welcome to Nicole and Michelle, and I would like to briefly introduce each of them before hearing more about the book. Nicole Civita is a food systems thinker, experiential educator, applied ethicist, integrative lawyer, and a responsive consultant who grounds in ecological knowledge, attends to relationships of care and reciprocity, sparks radical imagination, and pursues collective liberation. Nicole's efforts propelled multi-year projects to reduce food waste, revitalize regional food systems, seek justice for agricultural and food workers, explore ethical dilemmas across the food chain, and develops systems-aware, equity-enhancing laws and policies. After a decade of teaching and leading at colleges and universities, large and small, she is particularly gratified to have mentored a rising generation of eco-social change shapers. The juiciest lessons from that time are woven throughout her co-authored 2023 book, Feeding Each Other, Shaping Change in Food Systems Through Relationship, which is the focus of today's book talk. Her focus as an educator is now on EcoGather, a collaborative lifelong learning network focused on the vitality of agroecosystems, relational food systems, the transition to post-capitalist well-being economies, and the change competence of communities. She also runs a relational food system consulting practice, Plenty Enough, and is of counsel to handle food law. Michelle Auerbach is an activist, writer, educator, and a consultant who uses trauma-informed narrative theory to support individuals, organizations, and communities in shaping change. She works with businesses on change management, leadership, and creativity through story. She works with communities on creating social good, cultural change, connection, and working across differences through story. She coaches and teaches individuals through workshops, trainings, and one-on-one explorations. Michelle writes for the New York Times, the London Guardian, and has published 4 books, Feeding Each Other, Shaping Change in Food Systems Through Relationship, Resilience, The Life-Saving Skill of Story, Alice Modern, and The Third Kind of Horse. So pleased to have you both here with us today, Nicole and Michelle. Thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. Give me just a second to swap that screen share and we'll get started. All right, can everyone see that? Great. Well, thank you so much for making this space and for everyone for taking some time at what is always a busy time of year to move a little closer towards relationship with us to think about this book. Michelle, would you like to just get us started by telling folks what we came together to do?
So yeah, we came together at the beginning to write a book for a publisher who was writing a series on what are the changes that need to happen right now in the world that their books could support, so that people inside and outside of whatever system they were changing could have a guide. So I suggested to the publisher, oh, I know exactly the right person to do that. And what we ended up realizing after writing an entire book that we didn't use is that the way we talk about food systems is, I don't even know how to say this. It's both too broad and too narrow at the same time. And so what we were hoping to do was to bring in all of the things that touch food systems, understanding systems thinking, complexity theory, looking at economics, and talking about the ways in which we communicate, share, and create change. And all of those touch the food system. And then all of the current impacts of the food system as it stands, which is not feeding each other, right? It's got a history of racism and colonialism. It perpetuates those, it perpetuates sexism and all the other isms that we see as the outcome of that weird and sort of dangerous combination of capitalism meets colonialism meets extractive behavior. So that makes it bigger. That makes the whole thing way bigger than when we started off. But we also realized that we needed it to be trauma informed, because really there's not very many people living inside the food system right now who are not experiencing some amount of trauma from world events, from the existence of societal trauma that has been, perpetrated. There's just, and the collapse that we see kind of gearing up in our system in general. So we thought, oh, wow, now this is a really big book, right? This is not really just about food systems, but what it is just about is that the change that needs to happen in order to solve many of the things that we're facing is a change from a transactional system where the goal is to exploit, extract, accumulate capital, get something from somebody, to a relational system where we can use the wisdom of the natural world, where we can really deeply listen to each other, where we can actually start to shape change around the needs of actual individuals, where we can bridge across cultures. So we thought, okay, great, that's lovely. But if we just say that, people are going to say, and then what? So we put a whole series of both changes in the way we think, changes in the way we behave, changes in the way we practice activism, practice working in the food system, practice our relationships, that will help us to shift that paradigm from a more transactional towards, there's no such thing as perfection in this, right? Towards a more relational system. And then we realized that even describing that was a little bit mysterious. And so we really wanted to help people to see, like, what defines a transactional relationship versus what defines the kinds of relationships we're moving towards, which are empathic, relational, bridging kinds of ways of being with each other and with the world. So, and finally, we realized none of this makes a whole lot of sense if you don't have real examples of people who've actually achieved it, because theory is wonderful. I'm a big theory geek when it comes to a lot of things, but bringing in praxis and examples of people who have created exactly these kinds of change enhances the chance that people will see possibility and be able to say, oh, I could do that. My community could do that. My organization could do that. My class could do that, because it's been done and it's not some pie in the sky theory. So that was how we came together to write this book, and to really do it in a relational way where neither of us could have done it without the other person's expertise. And so we created that microcosm of a small bridging experience in writing the book, which I think helps it to feel a lot more real.
Oops, I went the wrong way. It was totally a relational exercise, and even involved us kind of sitting up here in this room that you find me in today, going back and forth, and often one of us getting so excited about a concept, a theory, an example, a case study we wanted to weave into the book, and the other person being like, whoa, hold on. Like, I actually don't even know what you're talking about right now, and having to go back and forth and really bring each other and each other's work into relationship. And so hopefully if you choose to read the book, you'll have a bit of that experience, and that will kind of create an aura and a energy or a vibe that we're inviting you into. And we actually were really excited about the format for today's event because it was structured very much in that way as well. So just wanted to name that. So as we start to talk about relational food systems, I've bolded the words relational and systems because I think sometimes people who really do understand systems thinking, right, that we have a set of interconnected elements that are connected, right, relating in some way to produce a goal, that systems are inherently relational. And that's true in that systems are inherently about the connections, the interactions, the dynamics of many things that are working together and influencing each other. But the question of whether this is sort of redundant or whether it's a meaningful reset kind of lives inside of how we inhabit, how we define what we mean by the word relational. So I invite you to sort of hold that question as we move through. Another important thing, and it is not that all food systems are entirely agricultural, but obviously most of what we've shaped in the modern global food system today is based on agriculture. And certainly the last 20,000 years of human history have been tremendously shaped by agriculture. And I think a lot of us who work in food system spaces know and recognize and have language around the move from agriculture to agribusiness. And after 10 years plus of working in food systems, teaching in food systems, influencing food policy, much has been made, right, about the influence of agribusiness, whether that's as lobbyists or as the influence in creating fairly toxic, non-health supporting urban food environments. And I think we stayed there for a while, sort of recognizing that there was a negative impact of agribusiness, but struggling to distinguish what actually had really changed beyond consolidation, beyond scale. And so we have really come out pretty hard, pretty definitively in naming that we believe we no longer have an agricultural-based food system, that instead we have an agri-capitalist food system, a global, growth-oriented, heavily financialized, commoditized, efficiency-centered system that externalizes harm and extracts profit from land and living beings, but does all of this under the auspices of a really benevolent sounding idea and goal of feeding the world. And once people say that, like, but that's what I'm doing, I'm feeding the world, and let me show you how the world would be hungry without me, without us, without our company, without our contributions, it's kind of hard to start arguing against that because it just sounds so virtuous and important, even when we have all the data to demonstrate the harm. And so part of what we are arguing for in the book and demonstrating how we begin to do is to say that if we know that we're not going to have a purely agricultural, subsistence-based food system in a contemporary context. I happen to live on a piece of land in a rural farming community. Most of you I'm speaking to today probably do not. And so we can't have a reset that depends on everyone returning to the land. We won't talk at length about that, but it would be very complicated if we tried to. But what we can do is root out the operating imperatives of agri-capitalism and place them with the imperatives of ag-relationship, which is a word we've coined. We made up several. And I do so unabashedly now because I think sometimes I remind myself that the English language limits us because it only has the vocabulary to describe what was and what is, and often not yet what is to come. So I invite you all to make up new language to go along with this with us. Agrocapitalism is feeding the world, but it is doing so, or in a manner of speaking, I should say, it's doing so through extraction, transaction, and limitless growth. Michelle, do you want to talk a little bit about what we mean by transaction?
Sure. So not only have we coined phrases, but we've also taken words that already exist and reappropriated them to describe the kind of system that we are currently living in, but don't need to be living in. And transaction, in the book, there's kind of a scale of what goes from transactional to more relational. Transaction, if you think of the most like divorced from any kind of connection way that you could possibly come upon a piece of food, right? That would be on the far side of transactional. So you give money to Instacart, which sends a person to a place where they are running through the store really fast because they're being ranked in their system on time and efficiency, not on, say, relating to the people that they're buying the food from. And I happen to be using this as an example because I was standing in the store yesterday behind the Instacart guy, and the person behind the checkout counter was, checking out the stuff and trying to chat with him. And he kept saying, I'm being timed. I'm being timed. I'm being timed. And so she just looked at me like, I don't know what to do with this. And, I can only ring as fast as I can ring. So at which point it arrives at the door, you never see the person right. And this is a very transactional way of getting food. It's not so much that you didn't grow the food in your backyard. I'm glad Nicole can do that. And her backyard chickens are lovely, but I can't do that. I don't have land. So it isn't that. It's the ways in which the system values what happens that makes it transactional. It's valued by time. It's valued by money. It's valued by efficiency. It's valued by calories as opposed to connection, as opposed to, relationship, as opposed to nurturance, as opposed to care. So that would be my transactional description.
Absolutely. And it's really reductionist, right? Everything is like unitized, exchanged in a way that kind of keeps us as separate as possible. The give and take should happen in relatively close time to each other, right? So it's optimized for long distance trade. It's optimized for time efficiency, and it is designed to deliver limitless growth and profit for some on a finite planet. And those are all things we think are deeply problematic. So at the same time, we hear that the system is fantastically successful at feeding the world. And we looked around recently to figure out if we speak the language of neoclassical conventional economists, how do they value the global food system? And there's lots and lots of different people who have tried to figure this out. Most of the estimates admit all of their assumptions and their partiality and all of the unknowns. But for the purposes of a quick comparison here, I decided to go with what the World Bank says. And they estimate an economic value of the global food system at $8 trillion annually. And at the same time, and in the same report, they estimate a cost of the externalities, the negative consequences on health, environment, and other aspects of economics, so like livelihood and well-being and development, upward mobility, at $12 trillion a year. So that to me seems like it's really problematic, because while we see a lot of value, the value is dwarfed by the harm that we're not counting. And if we did the math, we would see that we have a global system that is actually costing us, in the language I don't usually speak, but can translate into here, $4 trillion a year, right? It's a 20% sort of or more mismatch, depending on how we count and what we count. really doesn't seem to me to be terribly successful. And that's really just looking at like present value. That's not even taking a relationship to the future. So I was asked, even though I suspect that lots of the folks here with us today and watching this video have some grounding in some aspects of food systems, I was asked to give a little bit of the scope of the problem. And in the book, we were really deliberate about not starting with the problem, because after lots and lots of years of working in this space, I got really tired of reading books that all started with the same recitation of the terrible, depressing facts about the food system, about the specifics behind those $12 trillion of externalities, right? About all of the things that are going wrong. And so we waited on that. You don't get a long introduction, a first chapter where we start to move and introduce the relational paradigm before we get into, hey, what's going wrong? But it is important to scope some of this and get our heads around it at that big global level, even though we can map food systems, of course, from our households all the way up to the globe and everywhere in between. I checked last night, and when I checked, the human population was at over 8 billion. It's been at over 8 billion for about a year. And we're experiencing a net gain of 1 person every 22 seconds, which means that by the turn of the next century, absent cataclysmic kinds of events that would bring terrible human suffering, there are projections that we will reach 11.2 billion humans on the planet. It's a very profuse number for a species that requires the kinds of resources that we do. Of those, the most recent full FAO report on this listed about 828 million hungry people. And estimates between, and I've put the low end here, of 2.5 and 3.1 billion who have inadequate diets that don't support health. Also, 20% of deaths, and recognizing that we're all going to die, and that's part of the life cycle, but 20% of deaths are premature due to inadequate diet, unhealthy food, and malnourishment, hunger, etc. That's not great for a system trying to feed the world. We also see that about a quarter, a little more, of the human population is employed in agriculture directly and indirectly. Yet, at the same time, very few companies dominate post-production. You've probably seen this graph before of an hourglass, right? Lots of people engaged in agriculture. I'm going to keep my hands in the screen. Very few companies dominating many parts of the food chain. Also very few companies, I'd actually almost redraw this. There's also very few companies dominating inputs, fertilizers, seeds for the conventional system. So it's kind of narrow and then wide and then narrow again. And then everyone needs to eat and has a stake in this system. And the vast majority of people are not on full subsistence diets, even if they're subsistence farming. And so there is some level of exchange and participation happening. Out of all of what we produce, 1.3 billion tons a year, again, I've picked all of the low end numbers for this, are lost before harvest or wasted a year. And we've got more recent data on food waste that puts the food waste contribution of that combined number up higher, but we don't have new data on food loss at farms. So I'm sticking with the number from several years ago, recognizing that as our study improves, we're seeing that number, or our sense of that number, go up. It is about 1.5 quadrillion calories per year uneaten. I don't have any other statistics I use that are measured in quadrillions because I'm not like an astrophysicist. It's a tremendous amount of possible nourishment and energy being moved out of the system and turned, as it rots in landfills, into methane, a really potent and particularly short-term potent climate poison greenhouse gas. There is an estimate that if we were able to capture the food being wasted annually, we could feed 1.26 billion people, which means that everything happening in the second column could really, really be dramatically reduced if we did not have this distributive challenge and this tremendous inefficiency in the system. While we're looking at some of the harms, it's also important to look at the environmental and biodiversity, the climate pieces specifically. 37% of the Earth's landmass is used for food production. And then, of course, there is all of the marine fishery work. Of that, 25% of the agricultural land and soils is deeply, devastatingly degraded. And that number is rising at this point, not as much as we hear about regenerative agriculture. The net on that is not going in the right direction. There were lots of different numbers thrown out over the last couple of weeks with COP28 and the first time of really having food systems brought to the fore. I generally say it's somewhere between 1/4 and 30% of greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to food system activity. And of that, so that, about 8 to 10% of that is associated with food loss and waste. So obviously, we are accelerating the climate crisis, which then makes it harder for us to reliably grow food. And we have in the industrial food production part of the food system, a generally accepted caloric conversion ratio of 10:1, meaning we're taking 10 calories of typically fossil energy to produce every 1 calorie of food. And while we like to think about food, prefer to think about food in much more nuanced ways than just boiling it down to calories, when we think about the food system as a secondary energy system, which it also is, we see that that is tremendously inefficient. 70% of the consumptive freshwater use in the world is used for agriculture, meaning water is applied to food. Of course, because you've seen my statistics on food waste here, not all of that food is eaten, so much of it is applied, taken out of the watershed, and not returned. Returns eventually over very long cycles that we don't really engage with when we think about our ability in human time to recharge and continue to meet our needs or to sustain. I am not a fisheries expert, but I feel the need to put this in here because so many people rely on fisheries for important parts of their nutrition and their sustenance. 80% of fisheries are either fully exploited, overexploited, depleted, or collapsing. That's all the statuses of bad is a total of 80%. I rely on other experts to really get into the fisheries story, but I think it's important to mention. Of the plant-based foods we consume, just 12 plant species make up 75% of what we're eating. So on a planet of incredible abundance with untold numbers of edible plant species, we are far over leveraged and over reliant on just 12 monocropping and just this like real reductionist approach to how we feed ourselves that necessarily takes us out of relationship with the complexity of ecosystems and kind of robs us of the ability to form relationship with many kinds of plant and animal kin. You see something very similar, just 15 mammal and bird species make up 90% of the livestock consumed. And this is without talking about how much livestock we should be consuming. Here we're just saying our agrobiodiversity is terrifyingly thin, terrifyingly consolidated. And then of course, all of this mass conversion of landscapes into these monocultural spaces, into CAFOs, et cetera, has tremendously negative impacts on wild biodiversity. So a relationship between poor agrobiodiversity and species loss. And then, although I didn't have space or time today to go through all of the data on the intersections between all of this and public health, I suspect a lot of you are steeped in that, which is why I decided to leave it to the side. I do always find the fact that 97% more is spent on junk food advertising then on public health messaging, nutrition messaging, or just information about food. And I think if we fully included food literacy information, informations about environmental impact, we would come to an even larger percentage. If I'm remembering correctly, the study I drew this from was specifically looking at the delta between junk food advertising and public health messaging, which means we're dwarfed even more on the other important messages that should be coming through. Okay, that was a lot. What it tells us, Michelle, is that agrocapitalism doesn't actually hate any of the things that we have on the board here. Is there anything more you want to say about that?
Well, I just think that the message we wanted to get across is the food system is working really well, and that we do not have a failing food system. We have a highly successful food system if the transactional goals of extraction, exploitation, capital accumulation, are time efficiency, all those things we mentioned earlier are how you measure it. And the externalities are not something that the agro-capitalist system is having to pay for. So it's working great. They're making, 8 billion plus a year without having to deal with any of the externalities. So I think we wanted to be really careful to point out that agrocapitalism doesn't really have much concern for pollution, species loss, right? The precarity of the system. In fact, I think oftentimes the sort of disaster capitalism that we see uses that precarity, uses the ideas of hunger, or uses, co-opts a lot of these externalities and makes them part of their marketing strategy. So we need to say agrocapitalism, very successful, working great. However, not so much for us, right? And not only is it working really, 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 really well for making money, it's really working well to perpetuate the ideologies that make it possible to keep doing it, right? So these are ideologies of breaking, of separating out people's, classes, environments, and moving them as far away as possible from the people that might pay for their products, so that it is possible to oppress and extract with a certain amount of lack of awareness or even comfort. And so agrocapitalism has a lot of accomplices, right? It is a system that by nature grew out of colonialist expansion that seemed like it would never stop, that there would be this constant sense of use of resources and that they were just there for the taking, right? And so that includes imperialism, colonialism, racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, cis heterosexism, classism, ableism, all of these things, fat phobia, xenophobia, carceralism, which is something that we would love to talk about for about 6 hours, but won't, plays very much into this system, right? Of who actually over the course of the history of this country and other countries was growing the food. And we would like to say that the use of binaries is part of this system. So when we say transactional versus relational, we really mean a spectrum in there of behaviors, attitudes, actions, thought, feeling that is not one or the other, but has a direction or a movement towards one or the other. And that takes out perfectionism, which is not on this list, but should be. It kind of negates it, because I think one of the accomplices of agrocapitalism, because it goes along with white supremacy, patriarchy, colonialism, is this idea that there's a perfect way to do it. And that works so much to the benefit of agrocapitalism that we feel stymied and unable to act because we can't figure out the right thing to do. So when Nicole always says this, and I get to say it this time, when we sign the books, we always say move towards relationship. We don't say like create perfect relationship right now when you're done with the book, because that in a way feeds into our like freeze response to this system and these problems, because there is no perfect solution. There absolutely is no perfect solution to this, as you all know, because you've been studying some aspect of it for a good amount of time.
And every time you have really great ideas or experiments that are more relational, you'll start to get those questions of, does it scale? And then, you know, people are interested in what they can profit off of it, or how easily it can be replicated everywhere else and decontextualized, and all of that doesn't work either. I just want to quickly name that we talk about this as bridging versus breaking ideologies. We're borrowing heavily from the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley and the work of John A. Powell. And I think it's really helpful. It was really helpful for me to have that language and to think about all of these systems of oppression as things that break each other apart and prevent us from building thick empathy, thick solidarities, coalitions to change. And that we have to understand all of those systems as doing that on purpose, pitting us against each other so that we can't shape change together. And that's an important part of Michelle's work also. So I want to go quickly here and just move us toward what we're suggesting, but I will quickly say that there are all of these solutions, and some of them I feel better about than others. But we say pretty early on in the book is that none of these is going to save us if we put it into the heavy machinery of capitalism. It's always going to they're not robust enough to stand up to and change that over culture, that dominant paradigm, and they all get crushed up into the shape agrocapitalism needs them to be in, and kind of spit out mostly the same kinds of things, or they internalize the struggle into the individual actors. So like your farmer's market, it's a really beautiful alternative, but most of the local farmers there are struggling to compete with the agrocapitalist system. And so it causes some challenges. When we say that, people are often a little angry at first, a little upset, because we all have our pet solutions in there that we've been working toward. But many people also feel a little bit relieved by that, because it means that like the things we're not solving for, or the things we feel discomfort about as we do that work, actually is discomfort for a reason. And as we start to think about whether our pet solution, our favorite intervention can be made more relational, and some of them can and some of them can't, it's a way for us to figure out where to put our energy and how to engage with these things differently. So what we say is that nothing and everything is in fact wrong. The breaking all ideologies and systems are functioning, as Michelle said, as intended, which brings us to ecological, social, and economic collapse, which sounds really scary, and we lay out in the book, but we lay it out in a way where we call it the kind of trouble that advances the plot of a story, right? That cracks things open, that creates spaces in these new fissures for us to kind of go into the dark, radically imagine something different, to connect in relationship, and to do things differently. And we think that the thing we need to do differently is to focus on feeding each other, not feeding the world, agrelationally, which asks us to actually break that binary of global and local into a more cosmolocal way of thinking about things. Cosmolocalism comes from the design movement, unenclosed, right? Resisting intellectual property enclosure, saying we need to think about things as small, diverse, place-centric, and open, but connected, sharing knowledge across the knowledge commons, and engaging in specialized exchange of the things that can be sustainably grown in excess and traded, smaller amounts of trade. So as we move toward relationship, before we finish up our portion of talking to you, we wanted to just highlight some of the practices that we say are our sort of guiding principles for how we move toward relationship.
So again, no one of these things is going to solve the problem, and not all of them apply to any field of study or way of relating. So there are going to be ones that are more or less important to you in your practice. But Nicole just described cosmolocalism as the happy sort of swing between doing things in a local way and also gaining knowledge from other places and other people. We also talk a lot about what's a feminist ethical, that comes from feminist ethical history, this idea of connected knowing, that that we see a lot of the folks who we respect doing around, around their area of expertise. And it's not a knowing that allows you to extract, manipulate, right? It's a kind of knowing that allows you to bridge, to create deeper understanding. So that can be of other people, it can be of crops, it can be of systems, but a connected knowing, which also has in it an aspect of pleasure and respect. And pleasure is really important. It's luckily pretty unmeasurable, which we find great. It's very, when we try to use pleasure in an extractive way, it's pretty obvious immediately what that is. It's not something where you can say like, we're going to increase the pleasure by 27% this year. And the same goes for respect, that if we have respect for each other, which means that we've created a bridging relationship, respect for the land, respect for practices, other people's practices, respect for other people's realities. That's very helpful. There's a concept called ground truthing, which we combined into that some other things that come out of like the disability rights community, which is the idea that the truth comes from the people who are living it. Nothing about me without me, right? That you have to go to the people themselves. We use a story-based strategy paradigm to do this and find out what's really going on. We aren't gonna trust that somebody 7 layers removed who might be making money off of you is the expert on what you're doing. We do a lot around the fact that we are part of nature and that biomimicry is actually, well, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of an overstatement. We may be looking at how other species in nature act, but we're part of nature too. So we really can and may be able to act in those similar ways. Targeted universalism also is a concept that carries a lot of different parts in it, but the idea is that a community, a system extremely well, and that from that you can often extrapolate some very useful things that might be then applied differently in another community that has very different specifics. But this works very well with the idea of cosmolocalism because it's kind of the sociology version of cosmolocalism. We'll leave it at that. Universal reciprocity, and then radical imagination. So we talk a lot in the book about using story, and especially using science fiction story as a way to explore through imagination possibilities. And I think one of the binaries that we all are raised with is that imagination belongs to the humanities and it is not quantifiable and therefore not useful. And I've had an argument with an economist about this, that there are ways of knowing that are quantifiable and there are ways of knowing that are expansive and descriptive and maybe even predictive, and that we need to step into those. And both things are necessary. There's no one kind of epistemology that works better than any other one. And then reverence along with pleasure, respect, and universal reciprocity is a way of being in relationship that you also cannot quantify, but you know it when you see it, and you know it when it's being lived in a system. And then we also talk a lot about emergence and the idea that we can pick up these minute signals that are going on and move in a direction without having to without having to be directive, predictive all the time. So these relational moves, when applied to the work that we do, start to move it towards relationship and away from transaction, because many of them are really hard to do in a transactional system, which means that as you step into them, you will feel the rough edges of the transactional system. You will get to experience a tremendous amount of contrast, and that is really useful to our brains in the way we learn. It also necessitates community, collaboration, care, and coalition building, because coming up against the sort of rough and ragged edges of the system is not something we can do by ourselves. So these relational moves are not only relational in terms of the work we do, but they demand that we be relational with each other to support each other in the kinds of changes that need to happen.
And the last thing I'll say before we shift into the next portion of this is that these relational moves, which we talk about at length and introduce you to in the book, come from all kinds of different disciplines. I think at some point I went through and realized that we had quoted people from every continent except Antarctica, and then I figured some of the climate scientists were probably doing work there part of the year. But that they really come out of very different places, right? We have indigenous thinkers, we have theologians, we have ecologists and natural scientists, we have activists, and we're drawing feminists, ethicists, we're drawing from all of these different places in order to bring into the food systems discussion other sets of wisdom that really haven't, in my experience, been part of the discussions that we've all had as food systems professionals as we grapple with the challenges we're all here trying our best to solve. And that's part of why it felt really important to us to actually scrap the whole first draft of the book and start over, because we wanted to help catalyze a different kind of thinking and conversation. So I think I'll stop there, even though we could go on for a while, because we're really excited to hear what the rest of the panel has to say.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Michelle, for this wonderful overview and presentation of the book. So much excellent food for thought and discussion. I would like now to turn to our student panelists and transition to the panel discussion segment of today's event. We are joined by 4 CUNY students, each of whom brings a unique perspective to this discussion and have experience grounded in a different domain of the urban food system, from health equity to food access for migrant and immigrant communities, food labor and food workers, and environmental sustainability. Nana Day and Luis Saavedra are MPH students at CUNY SPH. Rachel Danifer is a PhD student also at CUNY SPH. And Shivangini Pandey is the Executive Vice Chair of the Graduate Student Council at the City College of the City University of New York, CCNY. And again, I invite you all, please take a look at our flyer to learn more about our student panelists and guest speakers today and their fantastic work. So to get us started, I would like to turn to Nana. Nana is someone invested in health equity and a student of public health. What thoughts and ideas did this book spark for you? And what is the first question you would like to ask Michelle and Nicole about the book?
Thank you. I wanted to say that the conversation's like really rich, and it always gets me like riled up to like hear the different perspectives that people who take the time to dedicate to learning more about this space, actually like the work and the labor of love that is encompassed in the book, I think is really evident. And when you were talking about agri-capitalism, I feel like talking about the links to imperialism and colonialism kind of sparked a question about power structures, because I think that that's at the root at what most of this is about. This is about how we can think about power and how we can see how it shapes our food environments. So on that note, I'm curious to know what you feel the role of power is in the food justice space and how that power can be distributed to advance food policy.
You want to go first, Michelle?
Yeah, I'll go first and just say that yes, the answer to the whole question is yes. But the power structures that keep this in place are ones that we see so nefariously cropping up everywhere that it actually brings me a certain amount of joy, because I feel like if we can begin to dismantle them here, it helps in other places, right? That everything is connected to food. There's very little in our bodies and our lives that we can't connect in some way to food. So I feel like we can contribute to these movements all around the globe and for all kinds of different change just by picking at the power structure here, because it's the same power structure. So if you're talking about mining minerals, right, in sub-Saharan Africa, you are talking about a very similar power structure that is exploiting the land, and you can start to make movement on that. So that's the good news, right? The bad news being that obviously they're pretty well entrenched power structures that have been around for, I don't know, since the Enclosure Acts in Europe, since all sorts of things have happened. So what we hope is that people will creatively begin to deconstruct that power in the food system, and that will be a contagious, virtuous cycle of change that we can only begin to imagine with radical imagination, because we've lived. There's this great Ursula Le Guin quote, who's a science fiction writer, and she talks about that, we feel like living under capitalism is inevitable, but we felt that way about the divine right of kings, and that too passed. And so the ability to visualize those changes comes to us from our radical imaginations.
To that, I would add specifically, I go back to that statistic I put up about 28% of people being employed in agriculture, and note specifically that doesn't include further down the chain food system workers, right? So like, so many of us are laboring on behalf of and within this system. And a lot has been done to make sure that as laborers, we don't have a lot of power at all. In fact, and we talk about a case study that we were both involved with the formation of Project Protect Food Systems workers in Colorado, and our efforts to root out some of the real structural racism in agricultural labor laws there. Lots of laws have been designed in order to make sure people laboring within the food system have some of the least power and the most fragility, the most precarity. And what we saw happen there was that when we could figure out how to reduce the precarity of those workers so that we could help others, because agricultural workers, of course, are among the most precarious, many of them undocumented and very unable to participate in public processes that matter to them. What we had to do was find a way to both provide material support through real relationship with them by mobilizing a team of promotoras, lay public health workers, who could come and provide real care and help meet their needs and gather their stories and then be their voices, shifting power and making it so that as much as the system wants to invisibilize the people who are most essential in keeping it moving, that they could not be completely invisibilized from those committee rooms where we were debating the bill. As much as what went on in those scenes was deeply, deeply racist and breaking and horrible, we had each other through it. And so not only did we do all of the things to build social movements in line with policy, in line with storytelling and data and fundraising and all of the things you need to do in a movement, but we also really cared about each other. So after we would have those terrible meetings, we'd all get back on Zoom and love each other through it and process through it and feel our feelings and scream our anger and rage, and then come back together again, because that was doing the work relationally. It wasn't me saying like, yeah, I've already put 20 extra hours in this week, I got to go like take care of my kids. It was just letting my kids sit and listen to us all yelling about it together and building those thicker relationships.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to turn to Luis now. Luis, based on in this really well dovetails with Luis' extensive work in advocacy for students as food workers. And he has been also involved in many other topics and arenas and invested in food system transformation and change through his MPH studies and work. So I would like to ask you, Luis, what thoughts and reaction did Feeding Each Other brought to you? And this calls for a relational perspective that Michelle and Nicole are making for food systems. Did you have like any reactions, reflections, connections to the work you've been leading and so much invested in the past few years? And yeah, what is your first question for the authors? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting comments on the notions of like efficiency, our food system is, as you mentioned, is extremely very efficient, but at the expense of the people who propel our system forward. And clearly, like the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed, the failures of our government institutions and even public health in protecting food workers. So I just wanted to in the topics of like precarious employment and just generally our food system. Can you talk about a little more about how, failing to ensure the rights of food workers undermines efforts to transform our food system entirely?
I'm going to start just really briefly because I was so happy when I read your bio, because my work in the food system has always been on the end of I was a student food worker in New York City, right? I was a chef. I would then went to culinary school. So I was a chef and I worked in restaurants in New York for a long time. And those systems aren't ones that are generally tracked when we talk about food production, because we're talking about agriculture and the negative externalities of agriculture, but we're not talking about the negative externalities that people experience when they work in the food system on the provision end, as opposed to the creation end. And so the ways in which, like the Promotora network, which I think was part of, what you wanted us to talk about, that the idea of going to folks in the food system and actually asking, what do you need? What's going on for you? What is your experience? Allows people to come together around really different issues. We went in thinking, at the beginning of COVID-19 with the Project Protect Food Systems, thinking, what do they need? We don't know. Well, it turned out part of what they needed was warm winter gear because they were still working outside. And that wasn't something you would necessarily think needs to be provided in a food systems change process. Would be, I need warm winter gear, right? I need food for my kids in my house, which is something you see all across the food system, that the people working in it are not adequately fed. And so, but by asking those, what do you need questions and building change around the actual needs of the people in the system, you have a very different kind of change than you have if you start from a theory and you don't start from ground truthing. And I feel like what doesn't happen in restaurant kitchens and with wait staffs and with folks who are doing DoorDash, who are all food systems workers, is that nobody ever stops to ask them, what do you need? What change would improve not only your quality of life, but your ability to make change yourself? And so what we saw in Project Protect was the desire to actually use storytelling, to use people's real lived experience to develop the change from that, as opposed to the other way around. And I think that that's a model that needs to get carried across, especially to folks who are doing the kinds of food work where you by default need to be invisible because what you're doing is happening under the table. And therefore, which is kind of a great food metaphor, it's happening, you're not at the table, you're under the table. And then therefore you can't really be brought into legislative or other kinds of really visible spaces. So I'll leave the rest to Nicole because she's the.
I'm going to go in a really different direction and answer this question in a way that I don't think I have before, because as you started, it made me start to reflect on the fact that, so Michelle and I both went to college in New York City. I was born there. My life is nothing like that now, but it is a big part of who I am and who I was. And I too did all of the service industry, restaurant jobs through college and after. And then I moved away from New York for a bit and came back as a first-year associate, right, at a big fancy law firm on the Upper East Side. And if any of you know anything about that life, going out to lunch and to dinners, client dinners, partner dinners, et cetera, is a big part of that world. And suddenly I catapulted through the upward mobility of higher education, which is another topic for another day that I have a lot of problems with. But I had catapulted from being the person mopping the bar and bussing the tables and seating the guests to sitting and dining in meals I couldn't have afforded myself in really fancy restaurants. And I could never enjoy a meal that I had, no matter how delicious the food was, no matter how fascinating and heady the conversation might have gotten at some point, because I was acutely aware of how most of the people around me, very few of whom were first generation college students, very few of whom had done that class jumping, were either treating or just not even acknowledging and regarding the humans around them making all of that possible. Instead, it felt like, and in an earlier era of life, I was in high school, I was very into theater, very nerdy about it. It felt like I was on a stage in a play, and the kind of stage where the stage crew comes out, a kind of play where the stage crew comes out dressed in black to move the set pieces around you while you're still singing. And the falseness of that, having known what goes on in the kitchen, having hidden undocumented workers in my apartment, having done all of the things that you do when you're a part of that system, was intolerable for me. And so I often, I'm someone who loves a good meal, I often at the end of a meal would realize that I hadn't eaten much. And it was because I couldn't understand the act of food as stagecraft, and the disregard of all of the people there. So one of the things I would say, particularly in cities that have such tremendous disparities, where restaurant and fine dining is such an important part of the culture, that we actually have to do the work. Those of us in those spaces, the restaurateurs, the celebrity chefs, the investors who are trying to make tons of money, we have to do the work to start changing the story and the narrative around what we expect in the spaces where we exchange food, because it is utterly transactional right now. And so I would do like little subversive things that would piss everybody off, like ask the person bussing the table their name and thank them, and stop the conversation of whatever the negotiation we were doing was, to kind of pierce that fourth wall, right? And try to visibilize something different. And so I think part of what I can add to this is that in addition to the power building and movement work, we have to disrupt the spaces where the invisibilization and extraction from the humans in the food system are. And like, there are going to be a lot of movement tactics to that disruption.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole and Michelle. And I do want to flag that Luis was also recently guest editor of one of the Institute's newsletters focusing on students as food workers. So I don't know if Katie, you can paste, or I can later the link to that newsletter. It just came out last week in the chat. So we invite everyone also to explore further, both through the book and this recent newsletter Luis put together also with interviews from former CUNY students and food workers. Thank you. So I would now like to turn to Rachel. Rachel, you have been so much invested in, more than a decade experience actually in public health evaluation and research. And your work has especially centered social justice, equity, including in the context of food systems and urban food systems in particular. So I wonder if you'd like to share what are some of your impressions from the book, and again, the relational theory of change Nicole and Michelle propose. And again, to share your first question you have for the authors today. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. It's great to be here and to get to share some of my reactions. And I first just wanted to thank you, Nicole and Michelle, for writing this book and for putting forward a real vision of how our food system can be transformed, and for showing us, you clearly really believe this yourselves. It wasn't an academic exercise, and I think there's just a lot of power in that. And you cover so much ground in the book, but I did, like Rosie said, sort of just alluded to, I did really love the focus on relational interactions and sort of how approaching our work with an explicit value on relationships can be transformational. And this really resonated with me in my work doing public health evaluation for well over a decade, and just thinking about how this has been a really important way to how I approach this work. Earlier this year, I was sharing back evaluation findings to a group, and someone thanked me for doing the work with love. And it just, it meant a lot to me. I don't think it's a traditional way we would think about approaching evaluation, but I do think the work is, more effective when we bring those relational approaches. And I didn't have a term for it before, so thank you for for that. I also really loved your recommendation for shaping change for our food systems by what I interpreted as like just talking about it. And pointing out the failures with the old paradigm, and you talk about operating with flamboyant visibility from the new paradigm. And I loved that because I think that actually can be so powerful. I think I've seen that help change happen in other areas, like talking more explicitly about racism, I think has been an important part of change in other spaces I've been in. So I've seen the value in that, and it just made me think like, oh, that's not that hard. Like I can do that. And it made me think about kind of how to bring that into other parts of my life. And Nicole, you sort of talked about this already, but I was really blown away by all of the different thinkers and writers you brought together from so many different disciplines. I had a similar list, like scientists, economists, but also philosophers and poets, and like the sci-fi writing, I was really not expecting. So I thought it was so great. It's so easy to be very siloed in our work. And I thought it was great to just be so interdisciplinary and like expansive and weaving together so many ideas. So those are some of the things that really especially struck me about the book. And I will ask a question. I wanted to ask more about the storytelling aspect of this. I think especially in the field I'm mostly in of public health, we're very into charts and numbers and information. And I think we have a lot to learn from the art of storytelling and the idea of narrative change. So I was wondering if you could just share successful ways you've seen others using this approach, or, a good way if you're new to it to sort of get started with that.
So I also worked for the New York City Department of Health early in my career, and find public health storytelling to be something that I am fascinated by. I'm also shaped by the activism that I was part of. This was in the late 80s in New York City, and I was involved in ACT UP, and I worked for the Division of AIDS Program Services. So I got to see, I had a very firsthand seat in some amazing use of storytelling. And so I'm thinking about a moment in history in which storytelling actually made enormous public health change. And the example that I use a lot when I teach is that the Women's Coalition of ACT UP set out to change the definition of AIDS so that more women, more people who had lower income, and more folks who were not white could actually benefit from clinical trials. And the ways that AIDS was defined at the time was really because of what doctors had seen from white gay men, which was obviously like the sort of big part of the iceberg, but it didn't cover everybody, and it didn't cover the most marginalized folks. And so the Women's Caucus of ACT UP came together and was like, we're going to do something about this. And a lot of what happened was storytelling, very public storytelling. And, people like Sarah Schulman, who was a journalist and did a lot of storytelling through journalism, and then there were people like Jean Carlomusto, who helped to found Diva TV, and Diva TV was the like video branch of ACT UP, and they recorded stuff and created narrative through video, which was really helpful. And I got to see the back of my head a couple of times, which is always super. It looks like, oh, it's the back of my head. I was in that. But it was very useful to start to change the narrative. And then there was a lot of acts of visual storytelling that were disruptive, talking about at baseball games. I mean, just amazing uses of that kind of storytelling. And what ended up happening was, and there were some people chaining themselves to fences. There was a lot of ways in which the change happened, but a lot of it happened through making things visible through story, so that it wasn't that the dominant narrative, which really benefited the homophobic, racist government that was trying to limit funding for AIDS research and for any kind of care, it was hard to avoid the reality once the stories were told. So that kind of public health storytelling, to me, is part of what we carried over into the bill that we did here in Colorado. And through we as storytelling kind of I don't know what to call it, encouragers. Like we weren't really teaching because there was a storytelling culture already where we were. When we started to prepare folks to testify in front of the legislature, one of the things we helped them to do is to figure out what's your story, like what's the story only you can tell that these people need to hear. And in so doing, they were able to bring to the legislature a lot of facts and a lot of statistics brought to life. And so there were stories that only people could tell who had worked with a lot of the workers who couldn't be there because they were not working, they weren't working in the system in a way that allowed them to like be public, right? They were people who were making the Colorado food system work and absolutely had no voice. So we prepared people for court, basically, for giving legislative testimony, but only as storytellers, not at, because that therefore their expertise could shine. And so it works in all kinds of ways within the system, whether you're changing policy or you're changing definitions, or you're trying to get people aware of what behaviors need to change, right? A lot of that is storytelling work. So especially in public health and in the food system, where people may not even be aware of the things that are going on in the system. The average legislator, the average consumer may not even know those things. And that's when storytelling really shines.
I think I would add that we're also like, if I take it up a level, we're really trapped inside a story about ourselves and about human nature that the colonialist capitalist era has taught us. And so for me, so much of that storytelling work Michelle just described is really important in the day-to-day transformation. And then this paradigm shift work about like, what are the stories that we have internalized about how we all exist, what we're doing here, what we're supposed to be doing here, what makes us good, and what are the characters we've shaped ourselves into in those stories. So I just told you a story about me as a lawyer that did not it wasn't particularly flattering about that part. And I have to be able to relinquish part of the status that comes with the credentials I put a lot of money and time towards earning, to be able to tell that story and share that story with you. I also have to be willing to name that I am and have been a lawyer and operated in spaces and done some work that I'm not super proud of, which maybe makes me less credible in some of the radical movement spaces I'm in. We have to be willing to inhabit our own stories and each other's stories flexibly to rewrite the ways that that we can relate to each other and who we can be in a world as we change the relationship we want to have to the present and the future. And that's where some of that sci-fi stuff you pointed to, just to kind of quickly name it, if you're ever going to write a book, go write a book with a friend who does not do exactly the same things you do, and you'll start to have crazy things come up. I didn't even like sci-fi before that. And I was like, really? We're going to put all this in the... And then I started reading and I was like, yeah, we're going to put all this in the book, right? This is all part of it. And so I think what's really important in all of this is that that talking loudly from the new paradigm, right? Even if you don't fully know how to do it, stop spending your time engaging on the people who are so bought into the world as it is, and start painting the pictures and doing the work of making the world as you want it to be, because it's an energy exchange, right? And so if love, as Andreas Weber says, is the pursuit or the characteristic of wanting to increase the aliveness of something, and we do that through care, holding people's stories with care, showing up in spaces with love, right? Even spaces where we've kind of been regulated and routinized into our roles. I remember I left social work. I used to be very early before law school, children family services social worker without the MSW, without the training, just kind of thrown into an entry-level position, working with kids in the foster care system. And I got written up for hugging one of them. And I just had to exit the field because I was like, I'm not going to be able to work with small children who I cannot put my arms around when they are crying. I can't do the kind of work that I think needs to be done And like, yes, of course, we have to be careful about where boundaries are, but we often set them so far to put so much distance in these systems that we're in. And like, if we think about our deep human history, a child who needed to be protected from their parents who wasn't able to care for them would not have been put into a system that was going to treat them like an object. They would have been cared for by other members of their village, of their tribe, of their social grouping. And so it's a non-food systems example, but one that makes me realize that part of the radical act is to figure out how you show up with love. And, you know, at 23 and with not a lot of experience or power in the system, I couldn't challenge that. But those of us who have the maturity, the positional power, the authority, the platforms, we should be challenging that, and we should be supporting younger folks who are also ready to be challenging in those ways.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Rachel, for this wonderful question, and Michelle and Nicole for your insight. Very powerful points there. Many insightful observations and things for us to also relate to through our own experience and backgrounds and multiple transitions in life, and also everyday practices, right? The things that we consider, you know, routinized are also radical sides for transformation. We are, you know, running out of time. It's such a rich and wonderful conversation and a relational way to lift up and amplify your work. I want to now turn to Shivangini for another student perspective. And Shivangini, you are a student leader at CCNY, but you also have a strong interest in environmental sustainability, another important aspect and sphere of transitioning to a more relational perspective on food systems, as Nicole and Michelle presented at the beginning of this event. So I wonder, what are some of your reflections related to that, and your question for Michelle and Nicole? And I would like to ask everyone to try to be brief, as I want to allow for a space for at least one or two questions from the audience. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you so much for having me here, first of all. And I am someone who resonates very deeply with the cultural integration of food and eating habits. So building on that, I would like to ask how embracing a relational view of our food systems can facilitate a deeper understanding and appreciation of the intricate connections between human health and the food system.
I love this one. I love this one because I think when Michelle went over what are the relational moves, she talked pretty quickly about the part of nature piece, and I think that's a piece that sits more with me and my work and you know, my philosophy and outlook on the world, what I've moved towards. I think in the circles I run in now, it is not provocative to say this, but I recognize that outside of my bubble it is. I really truly believe that humans are part of the natural world and not apart from it. And that itself is a tremendous paradigm shift. And if you're not there, right? Like, I invite you to think about yourself as a human animal, and to think about the year that we are in, not as the year 2023, but as my friend Sean Chamberlain says, as the year 202,023, right? Kind of lifting up the fact that humans have been on this planet for something like 200,000 years. And when we think of that depth of our history, it tells us a lot about who we really are, and that the stories that we have about what human nature looks like right now is really, really different. And so what has happened for me is, as I've moved towards a more kin-centric focus in my work, in the work that I do that is on the environmental side of things, I've really thought about, like, yes, learning from earth systems scientists and ecologists and all of those who've been schooled in the worlds of Western scientific analysis and have taught us so much important stuff about the planet that we are here and the state that it is in. But then also learning from often many Indigenous folks and Indigenous scholars around, like, the idea of really truly being a relation with land, learning from folks who are animist and thinking about the spiritual connections with place and with other more than human beings, and thinking about, right, my new thing is to really blow up time and think about the ways in which humans inhabited and sensed time before the imposition of clock time as a feature of the establishment of capitalism and the alienation of labor, right? Like that's a place that feels really rich and fertile for me. And so I think that when we try to think about, when we separate out like human and environmental health, and then we try to put them together because we're linking them and we're like, they have shared, like the harms have shared causes, so we can jam a solution in there. Like, yeah, we can, but I think we also have to start to think about ourselves as part of this earth metabolism, right? And part of a set of really uplifting relationships with each other, construed very, very broadly, and with our places and with our deeper histories. And I would love to talk to you and anyone else about that for long periods of time. I actually host spaces where we explore all of this, but I know that we're coming up on time here.
Thank you, Nicole. So we do have several questions from the audience. I'm afraid we don't have the time for all, but I want to highlight one in particular. It goes back to your interdisciplinary approach to the book and the multiple perspectives we are drawing to make the case for a relational shift. And the question is by Craig Willingham, who is also managing director of our institute. Michelle and Nicole, in light of your vision for transforming food systems through a relational perspective, how do you see your relational approach aligning with or diverging from the speculative yet realistic societal changes presented in Kim Stanley Robinson's work, particularly regarding sustainable practices and systemic change? Can you provide specific examples from your research or experience that echo or challenge the themes explored in Robinson's science fiction narratives?
We love you. That is, so we don't feel the same about Kim Stanley Robinson, but I found his exploration of the ways in which capitalism can be used in if you haven't read the book, A Ministry for the Future, this is an amazing book where they use the capitalist system and they go back to a more Keynesian form of economics where capitalism can be used to promote good. So they take a step back away from the Chicago school kind of ways in which America has disseminated neoliberal capitalism around the world and say, stop, we can value things like carbon sequestration, and then through so doing, we can change the system, right? The value doesn't have to be entirely about money. So I love Kim Stanley Robinson's work. I know a lot of folks who work in the field, he drives them crazy, but I also love another book of his, which is called the Science and the City trilogy, which is all about the same stuff as the Ministry for the Future. So one of the things that Kim Stanley Robinson is exceptionally good at, because his wife is a scientist, is that he goes to real scientists, he uses real science. There's very little in his book that is actually fiction. He's taking these very, very interesting scientific theories and ideas and things that are coming out of research and puts them into the book, and then says, what would happen if we did this? So in our work, we kind of do the same thing, which is that we grab hold of a piece of research and think, well, what would it look like? What would a world look like in which it would be possible to change this, right? And so one of the things to know about Kim Stanley Robinson is that he was the graduate student of one of the best Marxist literary critics that was like from the 20th century. So he was already looking at things from a very different point of view. And the question that writers ask is, what would have to happen in order for this to be true? Or what if this were true, what would happen? And so we do the exact same thing in the work we do. What kind of system would we need to create in which people actually got what they needed? And we use that to go backwards and say, well, what's not working? Oh, shoot, we're valuing capital accumulation instead of the accumulation of pleasure, health, joy, right? Community, relationship. Oh, right. So that actually caused one of the great, my dog is having a dream behind me. This is hysterical. So it's hard. She's making little woofy noises. But it helped us to start to look at, if we did need to make systems change, what would those system changes be? And to shift to another science fiction writer, I'll be really fast. N.K. Jemisin talks a lot about the fact that science fiction has just a factor, one factor different from the world we live in. And that change is enough to change the whole system. And so for us, we use that idea of science fiction and fantasy thinking to change the one factor, which would be a relational food system. What if that was the X factor? And then you can kind of write the book. So I think that it's possible for people in almost any discipline to take those two ideas of like what would need to happen if and the X factor and apply them with real radical imagination to making change. So thank you.
Super
But thank
quick,
you. I
super-
could not have been set up better for that question.
You really couldn't have, but super quick and super tactical. Since we published the book, I've started working with the Vermont Prosperity Project and the International Wellbeing Economy Alliance. I'm really thinking about, you have in Wales the example of a country that has passed a Future Generations Act, right? And so a stream of my work right now is looking at and thinking about, can we pass a Future Generations Act in US jurisdictions? Can we start in Vermont or California or various places? And talking to Sophie Howe, who was the first Future Generations Commissioner, and thinking about what does that one policy move, what does that one potential lever change for so many other spaces in which we do policy work. And so that's a real tactical way that we are sort of trying to live into the future we want to see by taking a different relationship to the future and bringing it into our present policy deliberations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who shared additional questions. Unfortunately, we are almost at a time, and I hope Nicole and Michelle may be open to continue the conversation beyond today's forum. I do want to invite you, Nicole and Michelle, if you have, and also our guest student panelists, feel free to use the chat if you would like to make any final remarks, calls for action, or just share thoughts or updates for your next project or initiatives for 2024 and beyond. Thank you.
So you mentioned when you went through my bio that my current work is really focused on something called EcoGather. And I would love to have you all follow us at eco.gathering, which I'll put in the chat in a moment, to join our newsletter, because every week we hold a free open space around a theme where we discuss lots of these topics and go in deeper. And we do so with the team that I lead. And so to the extent that you have questions that are unanswered or want spaces to be able to dive in further, just becoming part of that network, which doesn't cost you anything, and is a space that feels, people who've spent a lot of time in academia and policy and food system circles and not, all coming together to do this kind of exchange across the borders and boundaries, very transdisciplinary, but also just about who we are as humans. And as part of that, I did so good with those earbuds up to that moment. As part of that, in 2024, Michelle will be leading a 6-month sort of hybrid, semi-self-paced journey through the change shaping curriculum that we developed. And thanks to a really generous anonymous funder, we have the ability to provide seats in that journey for just a $75 commitment fee for 5 courses and 6 months of learning with Michelle and with each other on a series of classes that put all of these skills to work. We're enrolling that right now, and I would love for folks who want to continue this conversation to be able to be a part of that. So if there's a way, I know we're out of time, that maybe we can send some of that information afterwards and make sure people can follow up. I think that's the greatest invitation that I can offer you, because it's a way for us to continue moving toward relationship and continue exploring in these spaces.
Thank you so much. With that, we're at a time. Thank you so much to our fantastic guest speakers and authors today, our student panelists for their so rich and excellent and powerful insights and points you made today related to the book and your work, and also commitment to this hopefully expanding community of thinkers and practitioners around food as a relation. I thank everyone at the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute for their help and assistance during the organization of this event. We'll share the recording of this forum through our CUNY SPH YouTube channel, and also invite you to share with colleagues and friends. And yeah, thank you all for joining us from the academic work, community-based organizations, government, or maybe you are simply someone passionate about the future of our food system as much as we are. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.